What I'm currently focused on with artificial intelligence is helping people understand how to make the most out of AI. How can you see the big picture and really make the right moves for your career and develop your skill set so you take advantage of what is most likely going to be one of the biggest revolutions of our time. For a conversation like the one we're having now, if we were as inefficient as a large language model, they would have needed 20 or 30,000 calories, in LLMs. There's a lot of people who think that all we need is transformers or large language models, which again is a ridiculous proposition. Technology, in a way, it makes us lazier.
Stylianos Kampakis, good to have you here.
Very happy to be here.
So let's get started. I think for the viewers to get an idea of who you are, give us a background and give me an idea of what are you passionate about?
Yeah, of course. So I've been in the space of AI and data science for more than 10 years now. So I've been doing it since, before it was cool, really. So I've been in academia, I've been in the industry, I've been in the startup scene. I'm a 3 times published author. I've worked with many different universities across the world, including some heavy hitters like London Business School, UCL, and Cambridge. And I'd say I have many passions, right? I realized we share the same passion in music, even though mine is not as much professional as yours. And I'm really passionate about science and neuroscience. I've done quite a few things in this area across the years, but I'd say what I'm currently focused on with everything we're seeing in artificial intelligence is helping people understand that is professionals, senior professionals, junior professionals, doesn't matter, how to make the most out of AI. But I don't say this lightly. I don't say this from the perspective of, oh, how can you use a tool? How can you do your job a little bit faster, or how can you improve your skills in Excel using AI? I say this more from the perspective of how can you see the big picture and really make the right moves for your career and develop your skill set so you take advantage of what is most likely going to be one of the biggest revolutions of our time, because we are witnessing some changes that we haven't seen since the era of the .com.
Absolutely. Now, we discussed just in our little pre-chat, one of the areas of AI that you were working on originally, and now you've seen it come back. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so if you're referring to sparking neural networks, that's really fascinating, because I think quite often in tech, not only in AI, we get carried over by fashions. And there's all these different ideas and schools of thought, and at any given point in time, one of them seems to be dominating the conversation. And surprisingly so, this is large language models. And I say surprisingly because, this sounds like an oxymoron, right? On one hand, there's no question about the efficacy of large language models, and it's very fascinating to see that they're undertaking SATs and IQ tests and all that, and they seem to be scoring higher than a lot of humans. However, there's many other schools of thought in AI, and one of the most popular ones was a school of thought that was focused on biological analysis. That is, the main idea behind the school of thought was like, look, since we know that the brains are intelligent, but we try to replicate a brain. So obviously you don't need to replicate everything around the brain, like you don't need to replicate the design of a bird to create an airplane. But regardless, you want to replicate as many of those elements as deemed important, right? So large language models, they are based on a very loose biological analogy, and one of their key features is that they're extremely inefficient. Yeah, so they can do all sorts of things now. They've mastered language, but they spend so much energy that for a conversation like the one we're having now, if we were as inefficient as a large language model, they would have needed 20 or 30,000 calories,
What would that be in actual food, you think?
Yeah, I don't know, like maybe 30 or 40 burgers and, 5, bottles of Coca-Cola or something, which doesn't make any sense. So if you think about it, our brains are incredibly efficient. Yeah. And no one can really tell you why. Is it quantum effect, like Penrose had suggested? Is it the fact that they operate in 3 dimensions, not 2 dimensions? We don't know. But there's something in trying to replicate some of these functionalities and say, yes, we can use a biological, get inspired from biology in order to create something that's like a real neuron and try to create intelligence in this manner. So this type of approach seems to be doing a comeback, and as a way to solve some of these inefficiencies. That being said, it's not the only approach. I know there are companies betting on quantum computing or new architectures. Even though this is fascinating, in the last few years, I found myself mostly operating in the layer between theory and application, right? Because I think that now we're seeing all these different layers from now LLMs as the foundation, then new ideas being explored, and then we have all these layers of application from the superficial, yeah, which is what most of us are doing in our everyday lives, to the more in-depth elements from what would be an AI strategy within an organization, but what would also be a career invention for an individual.
Mm. I mean, that's a very interesting point, because the general public perception is AI, is LLMs. But as we again discussed, our belief and our approach is that there needs to be structure. So an example of structure, it's almost invisible. So if we think right now where we have 2 obvious laws, so the laws of the country, so that limits our behavior. So we don't go around murdering people. We understand that is illegal, so we don't. There are certain things that you can't do, so you don't think, let's try really hard not to do that illegal thing. And second of all, a very obvious one, gravity, the laws of physics. We operate within it, but we don't consider all the time, well, let's think about gravity right now, or temperature, the reaction of heat and cold. We instinctively respond and operate within those structures. So when you have something like a transformer-based LLM with the black box effect, where it's doing all of these things, it has pulling from a massive data set, but that data set is operating outside of structure, then if that in combination with the black box effect brings an unreliability, which makes it very hard to actually see that as a long-term future within the world. And something within, obviously, our brains does understand a whole design and structure. And you referred to, you've seen it more recently, looking at sort of graph-based structure, Palantir using a graph-based structure, and then applying the function of LLMs in a very smart way, without having a pure dependency on those 2 potentially negative factors. How would you interpret that?
Yeah, so I think the idea behind using some kind of ontology to represent knowledge within a large language model, and I guess that's why Palantir wants to use this method, which seems to be becoming more and more popular, is because it constrains the large language model. So if you want to impose a structure on LLM, now LLMs have become quite good at it. The early versions were not good at that at all. So quite often they'd hallucinate the wrong structure. Even so, if you wanted to, let's take a very simple example. You want to connect to an API, you want to get back the response in a certain format, let's say JSON with some attributes. Quite often they will get this wrong, and now that's no longer the case. So given that this problem has been fixed, if you can impose constraints within an LLM, you can make it pretty effective and cover some of the, avoid some of the risks that would have otherwise taken place. And how Palantir, I can presume, they're using this type of method is that if you impose an ontology within a certain domain, like the armed forces, security, cybersecurity, whatever, then you can assume that the LLM most of the time is going to make decisions taking these constraints into account. It's not going to deviate for them. So then you can use its intelligence, for lack of a better word, to pick up on trends and insights or whatever you want it to do, but it's not going to venture into some wild territory and come up with random stuff, which LLMs they tend to do.
And I suppose that's the other thing, data. What's the validity of data when you're pulling in so much data then you can't really verify? And from your experience, what have you discovered and seen as beneficial and problematic in and around data?
A lot of things, right? So I think the interesting thing about data is that on one hand, with this domain, they're kind of everything. On the other hand, a lot of the issues that arise with data, and I focus more on the issues because if you solve all the issues, what you have is a very clean and useful data set most of the time. But a lot of these issues are things which are not easy to fix because they depend upon cultural factors, that is company culture and processes and operations. And there can be so many, let's say, attack vectors or ways that data can become noisier, that in the real world, a lot of the training of a data scientist, especially when you're a practitioner, revolves around identifying these problems and coming up with heuristics to catch them early on. So then the question becomes, okay, so if data is like this, then we're just feeding all this stuff in an LLM. What would you expect to come out of the other end of this pipeline? And that's a great question because it does look like the data we currently have, even if it's coming from insane places like Reddit and social media boards, it's enough for the large language models to understand the structure of language. It doesn't look like it's enough for the LLMs to come up with logical reasoning. That's why OpenAI has been investing in getting people whose focus is to clean up this data set and come up with problems and training data for logical reasoning. And maybe it's not enough alone to come up with a useful pattern of interaction between a human operator and an LLM without the use of reinforcement learning, which was one of the main inventions that OpenAI came up with. This particular use of reinforcement learning from human feedback, which allowed the ChatGPT to be so easy to use.
So also give me some examples of some of the projects you've worked on before and how you've applied your personal approach to AI.
Yeah, so I think, if I could describe like my own professional strength, is because I come from a very multidisciplinary background. Quite often I come with these, let's say, new ideas which haven't been explored, but they seem to be quite effective. So this approach of using an ontology to impose constraints in a network is something I came up with around 6 months ago. And then I saw 2 months later that Palantir was working on the same thing. And last week I noticed that someone published a paper in this area. So I'm like, okay, that's an interesting one. Something else which I'm very keen on is combining more traditional methods with AI. So it's very interesting to observe these hype cycles in technology. So I've been in AI, in Web3, so I've seen some of these boom and bust cycles. Obviously, and I guess if you live long enough, you're going to see everything 2, 3, or 4 times in this area. So one of the interesting patterns is that when a new method is discovered, then people are very eager to throw everything out of the window. So, for example, during the big data boom, a lot of people were very eager to throw certain methods and techniques out of the window. They'd be like, oh, we have big data. We can just use linear regression with everything, and that's all we need, which was a lie. Now with LLMs, there's this and transformers, which is the underlying technology, technically speaking, in LLMs. There's a lot of people who think that all we need is transformers or large language models, which again is a ridiculous proposition. There's this guy who's made a career out of bashing forecasting methods and one of the things that he was recently bashing. I really enjoy his post because I think there's very few of us who actually understand what this guy is writing about so passionately. But he was bashing some transformer forecasting methods, and the people who come up with these methods, most of the time, they have no clue what they're talking about. So they do have their places in forecasting, but 9 times out of 10, they used the wrong way, whereas simpler techniques have existed for decades and they're quite more effective. And it's the same with large language models. When ChatGPT burst onto the scene, I knew we were in a bit of a bubble territory because I had all people reach out to me and say, oh, are data scientists still going to be around? And what do you need all these techniques and methods if you have a ChatGPT? And they couldn't understand that we have a huge literature of methods for many different things: medical statistics, forecasting, predictive modeling, significance testing, whatnot. It could take us hours to go through all of that stuff. And the best an LLM can do is choose the right method and then create an instance of a virtual machine and run this method to get back an answer. It makes no sense to use an LLM to replicate this particular method or to try and come up with a new method, right? It would be as inefficient as using our brains, which in a way LLMs have been modeled on very loose definition of our brains, using our brains to start dividing and adding and multiplying six-figure numbers day in and day out. It's a fascinating skill if someone can do this, but it's arguably pretty useless, unless electricity completely goes out, and for whatever reason you have to do these calculations. So going back to your question, I find it very interesting that things like the automated statistician that Cambridge University tried to do 10 years ago can now become a reality. So if you're like, look, this is the domain within I want you to operate in, right? Let's say you're a medical researcher and you have a knowledge of statistics, but you're not a statistician as such. So you can build an LLM and you can build the right constraints within it using an ontology or otherwise to say, look, now you operate within this domain. There's a type of problems that you need to face. So someone needs to upload a data set and you need to run the appropriate analysis. And it has this a la carte menu of methods, and it understands the domain in a way that it can run all kinds of analysis, essentially facilitating and speeding up the process of medical research. So these are the kind of things that I find very interesting, like this novel combination of methods in domains where their application is non-trivial, because you still need to have an understanding of the domain, and the method is not, because otherwise you're in dangerous territory, right? Which is one of the risks of AI.
Well, that hits on a very important point. So something we talk about a lot is subject matter expertise. But I find it fascinating that you've lived a life where it's the equivalent of multimodal AI.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
You've worked or had an interest or operated within multiple different technical regions, so to speak. Now, even within music, and we alluded to it earlier, being a musician, whether that's a guitarist or a pianist, being a producer, technical production, and we'll get on to the EDM vibe as well, songwriting, mastering, those are historically all different jobs. And people, to be really great masterers, that's all they would do. They would understand the frequencies, how to pull things out, how to create warm. So you're actually moving into there's a language iteration of interpretation of music. I mean, sometimes it sounds quite crazy when you're in the studio, you say, I need it really wide and warm. Well, what do those words mean? To the right expertise, it does mean something. And it's actually can be broken down into you're isolating a range of frequencies, and you're pushing something up, you're bringing something down, and the combination of all of those will achieve a result, which from a true producer, the role of a real producer is to produce a product, a commercially successful product. So it's understanding, being able to interpret all of these different elements to ensure there is no failure at every step of the way. And failure could be, well, it sounds great, but that won't work on radio. Or that's really a great song, but it's like Sting's Loot album. Is there a market for it? No. So it's thinking of all these different perspectives, which then kind of moves on to the sales and marketing element without really compromising creativity. So actually, anyone who can do many, many different things is probably better prepared to create a better outcome. And that's where really understanding all of those different elements within AI is good. And if something is very linear and ring-fenced, where all you've ever done is one job, and you train the AI on just that one thing, but you're not taking all other things into consideration which affect that outcome, then I suppose it moves into statistical analysis, which anything isolated can be whatever you choose it to be. But in the general, broader reality, probably needs a huge amount more consideration. Just thinking sort of from there, you're experiencing statistical analysis and using that as a kind of foundation for what is becoming AI. Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, yeah, that's another interesting question. By the way, I just wanted to also point out something you mentioned, that the relationship between music and language. I don't think is weird at all, because I remember when I was doing music lessons 20 years ago, there were these theories debating whether what's the relationship between music and language and which one came first. And it sounds like a bit of a silly question, but if you look into it, quite often music is using a question and answer type of format. It happens again, exactly. So, and also there are animals that are communicating through music. So it's not, it's not like a weird question at all. This thing is like, it probably demonstrates something pretty fundamental around how our brains work with our brains. And this is one thing that actually artificial neural networks are fairly effective in modeling, and is understanding there's a concept, and this concept is connected to other concept under certain conditions. So this is what all the weights are doing, right? So you're like, there's something called warmth, and then depending on which other layers are activated, this can take slightly different meanings. This is something that I think we've kind of cracked, I mean, the scientific community. But in terms of the relationship between statistics and AI, what is interesting is that machine learning, which is the foundation of what is now called AI, but what is called AI is essentially just a certain implementation of neural networks, which is a subset of machine learning. But a lot of the theories and methods and techniques, they essentially have been borrowed by statistical science, or they've been rediscovered. The most famous of these being backpropagation, which, believe it or not, was something that was rediscovered by Jeff Hinton, who won like a Turing Award and Nobel Prize and all that, and he's considered the grandfather of AI, who was actually a psychologist at Cambridge University. And he rediscovered backpropagation, which is still the go-to method for training neural networks, but it was already known to statisticians before that. The difference, obviously, we're talking about 84. So if you look into the history, I talk a lot about this in my third book, where I place a lot of emphasis in trying to help the reader understand the wider patterns in terms of studying intelligence and data, all the way from ancient times till now. And you can see up until the invention of the internet, there was a lot of free discovering. So literally, this guy could have walked into a different department and asked anyone, like, hey guys, do you know about an algorithm that can do X and Y and Z? And he just discovered this algorithm on his own. It's just the context was slightly different, because in statistics, statistics was born in an era where data was scarce. It was very expensive to collect data, and it was also expensive to do calculations. So if you think about it, you're like, oh, I need to take a sample of 20 or 30 or 40 people. So I need to go out there, right, and actually get this sample. And then I need to run these equations by hand twice just to make sure. And maybe this would have taken a couple of days, even if you were really proficient, using, pen and paper. Whereas after the 80s and the 90s, there was a larger shift towards experimentation. And that's why in machine learning, and this is reflected in LLMs, there's a higher focus on tinkering with theory coming afterwards. And that's why in domains where some kind of robustness and guarantees are important, like medicine, you still see statistics as being the king. And it's only recently that the FDA started being a bit more lenient with approving devices, medical devices that are making some use of machine learning and AI. Whereas in other areas, let's say marketing, there's a larger emphasis on just doing whatever it works, trying out wild ideas, and things like AI and machine learning have taken off. And finance being another good example. Finance is always very, forward thinking, because if anything works and can make money, they just adopt it, right? So they were like miles ahead of any other industry in the way they were using machine learning.
So, I mean, that's a fascinating point, and something which is probably, I wouldn't say ignored, but misunderstood, in the sense that if you compare 2020 something post-pandemic, 2010, 2000, the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, and we went back to, let's say, World War II, around 40s, and we looked at what information was available. Of course, we've had technical revolutions throughout that, which has obviously been the closing off the Industrial Revolution, propagation of television and the internet. So the availability of data from a consumer standpoint, even the human experience standpoint, and then also from a business standpoint, it's near impossible to say like for like, because it's just not the same.
Yeah.
But with the amount of information which is now available, and then the unreliability, because it moves into a social aspect. So do you believe everything in the internet?
No one does.
No,
I mean, it's impossible.
I mean, we talked about Wikipedia and Google. So even if we just said go back 5 years, would someone today understand, if they're young enough, what Google used to be like? I mean, let's elaborate on that point.
Yeah, that's a great that's a good question. I guess there's many different layers to answer, many different ways to answer it. So I mentioned a story earlier, which I found fascinating. That I had a feeling which I didn't have for around 20 years. I clearly remember this moment because these moments are so rare, and you probably need to have a certain affinity for technology to also appreciate this moment. I was a psychology student back in Greece, and I wanted to look something up, and I was in a lecture. I'm like, oh, I have to go to the library, and what time does it close, and all that. And then I realized, wait, I don't have to go to the library. I can just go back home. They didn't have a laptop back then. Most people didn't have one. I can go back home and just Google it. And that's when I realized that, oh, you don't need, a library. You can just Google something. And this was just a turning point, 2004, when Google started playing a larger and larger role in our lives. And then it was, I think, became part of the Oxford Dictionary a few years later as a verb, like I'm going to Google something. And I had a similar feeling recently with ChatGPT, Claude or whatever, like ChatGPT, just because where I realized I was using it in a certain way that I wouldn't have been able to use Google or anything else to get answers and help me with something I was working on. And I had the same feeling that we're witnessing not just a paradigm shift, but maybe even let's say, I don't know what's the right word for it. It's some kind of lifestyle shift around, both in terms of how you do your job, but also how you go about certain things in your day-to-day life. And also so many things are speeding up, right? So the other day I was at my daughter's birthday party, and I just had an idea, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna forget it, but I don't want to go and work now, I'm at my daughter's birthday party. So I just quickly asked ChatGPT to do some stuff for me while just using voice commands, and just started interplaying with ChatGPT in this way. And I realized that, wait, there's so many people on this planet that are doing this right now, and this is speeding everything so much. However, I think most people haven't figured out the best way to make use of this technology, because what I just described, there are many other people doing it, but most people who are AI users haven't realized they can actually do this, and they haven't realized they can do a lot of other stuff, which is what we saw with Google search or other ways to use Google, to monetize Google, to run a business based on Google Ads and all that 20 years ago. And what I find fascinating, and I keep thinking about it all the time, also being a professional in the space of education, is how can you better prepare people for this world? And sometimes when I speak with professionals, I'm like, look, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I also want you to tell me what you do in your job. And then we need to sit together and come up with ideas. Because if someone tells you they have a pristine, clear picture of what the future looks like, they're lying. No one does. Even look at interviews like Zuckerberg, Altman, Bill Gates, other people. They all agree there are going to be fundamental shifts in the way we do a lot of things. No one can agree on the how things are going to look like.
I mean, effectively, this is what I would call the Microsoft versus Apple problem approach. Going back to when Steve came back to Apple, and the difference in thinking from the origins of Microsoft, they created something very, very clever and said to business, this can do this, that, X, Y, Z. And business had to figure out a way to make their business utilize the capability because it wasn't a natural fit. With Apple's approach, it was, let's observe how you work, live, play, and how can we complement that. So it wasn't, the bare fundamental wasn't, we need to change you, because if you have to change your customer, then suddenly you've got this huge cost and education to kind of put into place. Anything which is change and behavioral change, so kind of tips onto psychology. If you need to change people's psychology, there's not going to be rapid adoption in the most efficient manner. There may be rapid adoption, but not necessarily life-changing in the first instance. If you can complement how someone already behaves and achieve scale, because we were talking about this as well. So what are you already doing that you could do in a tenth of the time? Well, that's interesting. The real future capabilities will probably not be those. There'll be something else that we haven't quite realized just yet. I think then technology will, or AI will evolve in a manner that does put structure, planning, psychology, and all these other elements and scale at the core, at the heart of it, because then it just makes sense. But whilst it's requiring behavioral change, then it's more problematic. But again, if we look at the type of people working on it, how many are really going deep into the psychology? How many looking at the multi-domain elements at it? They're probably very linear, which is why, you know, the view of a Silicon Valley startup has typically tended to be more, this is what everybody wants. But life in Silicon Valley is not like it is in Raleigh, Essex, or
Correct, yeah.
you know, Bradford, or I don't know, Lille, anywhere around the world. So how do people actually live, and how could you live and work, and how could you complement that? I mean, how would you approach that?
I think this is going to, we're going to discover this organically, right? So going back to behavioral change, something which surprised me recently is that, well, first of all, in terms of, let's say, UX, I think AI has cracked, let's say, the code of human language, which is our natural interface of interacting with, you know, other intelligent beings, which for the most part is us or animals, yeah? So it can get easier than that in certain ways, unless, you know, you can start using brainwaves and things like that, which we're probably a few years away from this, and then it raises other types of questions and ethical concerns. But there were some prompts circulating on Twitter recently and maybe other places where the prompts were like, oh, now that ChatGPT now has access to your whole history in terms of context, ChatGPT, tell me all the mistakes I've done, and, you know, tell me what my personality is like and how to improve and achieve X, Y, Z. And I'm like, what happens if this thing at some point takes off, and then people start taking all this seriously and it is actually effective, and then you have maybe younger people or kids whose personality hasn't fully formed, and they start interacting with AI as an advisor, and the AI is like, oh, you know, you're 15, this is what you should focus on. You know, and I'm not talking only about political biases or and whatnot. I'm talking about taking advice about how you live your life and your behaviors from an AI. Someone might argue that, hey, the AI actually might have better understanding of human experience than a therapist or a teacher or whomever, because it has so much information and maybe it can understand human level patterns on a completely different level. And it might be true. And the question is, I'm not saying this is wrong, right? So what I'm asking is, what if this is actually more effective as a method of, you know, receiving some advice and then taking certain actions around your life, call it therapy or whatever, compared to more traditional methods?
But again, there's weighting there on certain aspects. I mean, it's all subjective. For example, you're Greek, mainly English, but Newcastle, Geordie English, which is very different to other parts of the UK. But if you're Spanish or if you're, I don't know, German,
Mm.
do we hold the same values growing up? Are we taught the same? I mean, it's in many ways not even cultural, it's societal.
Yeah.
So how are you brought up and raised depending on the socioeconomic circumstances of your family? Is family front and center? Is it not really a family orientated culture?
Mm.
Will AI be homogenized across the board and say all young people need to behave in a certain way being taught? Or are they going to be more specifics? If you're born and raised in Berlin, would that AI teach you the same as if you're born and raised in Manchester? That, again, there's so many variables around it that unless so many things are thought out, which I suppose goes back to, you know, the incredible value from a human perspective, like you're thinking that what you bring to the table, you know, myself and many others, is we instinctively know there are considerations that should be there. But does AI instinctively know that? Because AI is fundamentally taught at its core by the structures given by humans. So what happens if you have two opposing countries, let's say introducing politics, and we've talked about attack vectors? That would be something would be great to kind of elaborate on. But where does opinion come from, and how could that be weaponized?
Well, I think a way to weaponize it based on the pre-chat we have is to simply feed a certain type of information in the AI, and then you know, you can either feed it directly, like prompting it, or you can just start posting things everywhere on the web, and then you're like, oh, it's going to pick up on this, and then it's just going to reproduce it. Obviously, we've seen this happening with now all search engines, right? So if you look into Google versus Yandex, especially the Russian version, they show different results, right, for the same queries. So you're like, what's true and what's not? And obviously, everything's controlled to a large extent. And I guess the problem with AI is that maybe it's easier to fool you in a way. And I wouldn't really trust, you know, anything political. You can't really trust a tool that's controlled by a big corporation, whether it's or a website or whatever. You need to think to form your own opinion and look to multiple sources. But I guess the thing is that in terms of AI being useful in our day-to-day lives, you know, all kinds of things, copywriting, coding, you know, market research, you don't really care about it being political, if you know what I mean. You just want it to have a good understanding of certain areas and some logical reasoning capabilities. And that's like a lot like the version of the internet that most of us are familiar with, right? So you know that you can't trust Wikipedia on anything relating to politics, but if you want maybe to learn something about, I don't know, fitness and health, or some literary figure, or some other historical figure, especially, you know, from ancient times where there's maybe not any real, you know, politics associated with what happened 2,000 years ago, or maybe there is, depends on the country, you can probably trust it, right? So in a way, you will never be able to outsource your critical thinking to a machine. I mean, you know, if you actually think of outsourcing their thinking to an AI, that would be a very dangerous proposition, because also, like, technology in a way, it makes us lazier. So when I first moved to the UK, I was in Edinburgh, Scotland, and you know, I didn't have a smartphone back then. Not everyone had a smartphone actually, so I had a map, right? So you could see tourists with maps like all over Edinburgh, just trying to find their way around it. And I very quickly soon realized that the whole city was like a platform game. You know, these games like with Super Mario or Sonic, where you have to jump on different levels. So there's multiple levels, and it's like, but I swear, like I'm at the right place. I can't sit. And then I realized that there's a bridge right above me, and I'm like, oh, how do I get on this bridge? You know, obviously, like, you can just double jump like Super Mario and go there. I had to find another way all around the bridge. But because of this, I'm still fairly good in reading maps, even when I don't have internet access, which I believe a lot of young kids, they can only use Google Maps. You know, they even need an arrow to show them where they're going to, otherwise they're lost. And I think this is happening with arithmetic. And if this happens with critical thinking, as in we just outsource it to an AI. That's really, really dangerous, because humans, we do have the tendency to take the path of least resistance. It's part of our nature, right? And if you look into things like motivational psychology and even some kinds of therapy, a lot of stuff is around how to either rewire your brain so you do something in a way that it doesn't really you don't really use as much willpower, which is a finite resource, or at the same time, how you can preserve your energy in other ways to invest it in certain ways, right? And I think this is where also some of the hustle culture and all that comes from.
Well, I mean, it's very much the last 10 years thing as well. Somebody said to me last week that the human laziness element, and it's not to be critical, but over evolution, if we have hunted something down, we probably need to make it last. So it's almost instinctive within us to be efficient and to expend as little energy as possible. But I suppose on the flip side of that, one or two within a group would have the drive, determination to constantly be out at it.
Yeah,
But it's
sure.
like people with a higher risk appetite, which makes sense. And I think if you then begin to apply that to the financial industry, I mean, it's probably a good segue to get onto tokenization, because that you've seen this with the crypto industry fluctuating a huge amount. It's almost like taking several decades and squishing it down into a very short space of time. So elaborate on what you've seen there and what your involvement has been in there.
Yeah, so in terms of tokenization and tokenomics, cryptoeconomics, however you want to call it, so I went into the space in 2017. The reason being that I was fascinated by complexity science. At some point, I was seriously considering moving to California to the Santa Fe Institute, that was the epicenter of complexity science. That was essentially an approach to explaining, the kind of trying to explain everything, really. You know, I was writing about some of this in my book. So it was this shift somewhere around the 90s in terms of scientific thinking from, oh, we have this nice mechanistic view of the world and simple equations, to the world is incredibly complex and extremely nonlinear, and we're better off running simulations and trying to figure out the possible trajectories, which in many cases they can be radically different. And there were a lot of tools to try and study all that, but most of them ended up just being useful analogies. Because the discipline that's that should have been affected the most by it, and unfortunately it hasn't, is economics. And during the financial crisis, a lot of this just resurfaced, right? So I was just doing some research into this area out of hobby, but I quickly realized that it's impossible to make a dent in that area, because it's such a mess. On one hand, you had a set of incredibly complex tools that didn't have much practical applicability. On the other hand, you have, you know, economists and national structures, European national structures, and making a dent in this area is something that's pretty much impossible. And you can probably name the few people like Friedman or Keynes that managed to do this sort of thing, right? And then I just forgot about it. And then Ethereum became a thing. So Ethereum essentially allowed anyone to create their own token economy, which means you could create your own closed system and say, look, this is my economy, this is what I sell, and these are my tokens, and this is why you want to use them. And I started studying this novel concept to the extent that at some point, when you would Google tokenomics, my personal website would be #1 on Google. There was a post called Why We Need Tokenomics and Tokenomics case studies, things like that. So then I started getting inquiries. There were all kinds of startups that needed help with this area. So I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna help you out, and so on and so forth. And I found myself like deep in this area. So what is fascinating is that it's two things. On one hand, it has progressed a lot. So I've actually tried to do a lot of stuff, whether it's write papers, develop my own simulation tools, or otherwise, to progress this area and formalize to some extent. The interesting thing is that because token economics is more constrained, it faces a fewer externalities than real economies. It can actually be formalized to a higher extent, even though the same principles apply between economics and tokenomics, like demand supply curves, etc. At the same time, crypto is a crazy world, crypto Web3, whatever you want to call it. It goes through these boom and bust cycles. it goes through the rise of messianic figures that then they get demonized, sometimes for good reason, like SBF and FTX and Terra Luna and all that. And it's a very, very wild space, right? And quite often, because I'm actively involved in this space, it's very interesting to see as the market goes up that quite often you see some really, really crazy ideas. And in terms of new startups and new ideas and all that. What is a bit sad for me is the fact that they're quite often very useful technologies which are used in the wrong way and then they get forgotten. So I think NFTs are very powerful, but they were kind of abused. The metaverse, I think it has a lot of applications in education, and we're actually I'm working on a metaverse project, so we have our own metaverse as a classroom because I think it can make a lesson more engaging if you have to do it online instead of doing it on Zoom. And then recently we saw the rise of institutionalized crypto, that is ETFs, stable coins, securitization/tokenization, real world assets, where in terms of technology, the technology has been kind of there for a while. It's just that the main hurdles were regulatory, political, compliance, and all that. So very interesting space, 100%. I just think it's a case of, if you look into the core use case of blockchain and crypto, it's around infrastructure, the infrastructure of value, of how we exchange value, how we store value, so on and so forth. And you get this weird effect where you have something that can be revolutionary, but it kind of requires you to just completely remove and destroy the old system. And then on the periphery, you get a bunch of crazy things and speculators and fraud and all that, which is different to AI. Whereas with AI, we see a lot of grassroots stuff, right? Oh, ChatGPT is a thing. You access it on your phone. It helps you do your homework, and then the teacher gives you A plus. Some people try to marry the two, but I don't think a natural synergy, right? So there are some cool ideas in the way that you can use AI and crypto, most of them in the area of decentralized physical infrastructure, that is securitized GPUs and use them, to train models and whatnot. But that's because they're like two cool ideas, doesn't mean they merge that well. It's the same with quantum computing, which is another thing that we hear a lot about recently. And I suspect it's going to be like AI, as in nothing is happening and then everything is going to happen at the same time.
Yeah, it's going to be a big bang.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So a couple of final few things. Who are your idols? Who would you look up to? I mean, for me, as an example, Richard Feynman. He was the coolest guy ever to have existed, in my opinion. Who have you looked up to?
Yeah, okay. I never really thought about this question that much, but trying to answer it, I tried to come up with some of the figures that I was writing about in my book. And I think you always have to judge a historical figure within the context of their time. So I always admired Aristotle because I'm like, this guy came up with all of the principles of modern science in an era when most people didn't know how to read and write. So I'm like, he just, as well as Archimedes, who was obviously a math genius, he just came up with everything in geometry on his own. But that's like a very rare case, In terms of more recent, let's say, figures, I always admired Shannon as well as Turing, who had the foresight to see the mathematics behind what would be the backbone of the modern, I don't want to say the modern engineering, but we live in a very, let's say, computerized world, right? It's a world based on computer science and engineering. And these people, both Turing and Shannon came up with information theory, Turing came up with the concept of a computer. They had the foresight to formalize these things mathematically. So obviously there's a lot of other things that had to take place to come up with inventions we currently have. But it's kind of a crazy idea to be like, look, I come up with a set of formulas. And it's similar to the things we're discussing about AI and neural networks and all that. I come up with this formula, and 20, 30, 40 years later, something else is going to come into fruition. And then I'd say maybe different individuals. I'm not sure I can name, all of them, but that's more of a general remark. All the people that have the conviction to stick with something, even if they know that no one else believes in this in that moment in time. Hinton being the most recent example, And he's the only one out of all these people who's still alive. But he really stayed in his lane. He's like, look, I believe in this approach of neural networks, even when in the 90s and 2000s, no one wanted to hear anything about neural networks, which also proves that a lot of the things that we take for granted and discovers, there's a lot of there's always like a lot of up and downs, and it's not very easy to say, look, whether this staying on your course is like a fool's errand or you're actually a visionary and you're going to be vindicated.
Yeah. Is it madness or genius?
Yes, it's difficult to say, in hindsight. It's very easy to say, oh, this and that. Yeah, but that's like in terms of scientific figures. Probably, if I'm gonna think for a few minutes more, I'm gonna come up with some more people. But we can always drag on forever and forever. With
So, and I think the final thing, the name of your books, what your books are about, and where they can find, where the audience can
oh
find.
yeah, they can find them on Amazon. So the first one is called the Decision Maker's Handbook to Data Science and AI. So it was based on a series of workshops which Cecily gave. Is what started my whole career in executive education. And it was published quite a few years ago, 2017, 18. And it's essentially a guidebook for a decision maker who wants to know more about how to use data science. There was an update, a third version last year to talk more about AI, and potentially there's going to be another update because AI is moving so fast that I have to redraft like whole chapters in the book, and it's interesting but a nightmare at the same time. The second one is more of a university textbook for business school students called Business Models in Emerging Technologies, and is a helicopter view of emerging technologies. And it suffers from the same problem that it has to be updated all the time. I'd say the first book is probably way more relevant to the audience of this podcast. And then the third one is called Predicting the Unknown, the History and Future of AI and Data Science. And I think if our audience enjoyed this conversation, that would be the more relevant, because in my book, in the third book, I try to combine different themes at different historical periods, but the history moves in is linear throughout the book, right? From ancient philosophy all the way to large language models, explaining the common thread between all these points in history and science. And the reason I'm doing this is because when in doubt, zoom out. That's something they say, in finance, right? So when you can zoom out and see the bigger picture, you're like, aha, these are the patterns that repeat themselves. And I make some suggestions in the book as to what we might see in the next few years or so. But I feel the book also equips the audience with enough information to make their own judgments. So I talk about Shannon, I talk about Turing, I talk about complexity science, I talk about economics, I talk a lot about different principles which might not be as popular now, but they will become more popular later. Like Nassim Nicholas Taleb was also very good in, I think he did something like this in economics, so tried to do this thing in AI. And interestingly enough, the original title of the book was called Uncertainty, but I was probably trying to aim too high because my publisher said that it's a bit too obscure, a bit too fancy, because I was trying to really enforce this, enforce maybe is not the right word, this concept around the fact that the thing that, the common thread between all these things, from, propositional logic, let's say the simplest formalization of a logical reasoning, all the way to statistics, and then computer science, and then machine learning, and then AI, and so on and so forth, and then other branches like data mining and information theory and all that, has always been the study of uncertainty, which pretty much, like you accurately pointed out earlier, that there is a principle in us around the conservation of energy. Maybe it comes as a mechanism to fight entropy. There's also a principle to fight off uncertainty, in the sense that uncertainty is a threat to our survival. In a completely certain world, essentially survival is maximized, obviously entropy notwithstanding. And once you realize this, then you start seeing other patterns in the way that technology will most likely develop, as if there's some kind of periodic table and you're like, this is the element that's missing. This is what the industry is going to work on next, or this is, let's say the next trend that might take over society or economy or the market.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense. I mean, to me, I always think the guide to the future sits in the past. And if we understand that, at least we've got a better idea of what could be coming.
Mhm.
So on that note, Stylianos, it's been a
It was
pleasure.
a pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.